Alright, here we go with another installment in this series on the book of Romans that I've been working on. And the passages, the verses that I would like to cover this morning is Romans 5 verses 15 through 17. And if you're watching this, I would highly recommend that you follow along in your Bible looking at the same verses that I'm looking at. So let's go ahead and read the passage. I'm reading from the New King James Version. And let's just read it and then start working our way through these verses here. So in Romans 5 verses 15 through 17, it reads, "But the free gift is not like the offense. For if by the one man's offense many died, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. And the gift is not like that which came through the one who sinned. For the judgment which came from one offense resulted in condemnation, but the free gift which came from many offenses resulted in justification. For if by one man's offense death reigned through the one, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ." Now, in the last lesson, we only covered 3 verses out of Romans 5 verses 12 through 14, and they were difficult verses, and so we spent quite a bit of time discussing some important historical interpretation issues. And for the rest of chapter 5 verses 15 through 21 to the end of the chapter, it also contains some very difficult verses. So in today's discussion or lesson or sermon, whatever you want to call it, we're just going to cover 3 verses again, verses 15 through 17, which we read. And in the next discussion, we're only going to cover 4 verses. Verses 18 through 21. And so I believe it's more accurate when I'm going through these verses to use the term discussion to describe what we're doing here rather than a lesson as we work through these verses, these remaining verses in Romans 5, simply because of how unsure I am about how to understand the rest of this chapter. And it's not just me. So let's discuss Paul's words here in Romans 5 verses 15 through 17, where he's talking about this gracious gift of justification, whatever he means by that, and about how the grace of Christ has a greater effect on us. So in verse 15, he's talking about God's grace, how it abounded for many. He says in verse 15, and I'm reading from the New King James Version, it says, "But the free gift," and the word there is charisma, free gift, they're using, well, it's one Greek word there, it's just gift. But New King James Version says, "But the free gift," and it's talking about, I think, Christ's redemptive act of grace. The free gift is not like the offense. It's not like the trespass, the fault, the transgression. It's not like Adam's corrupting act of sin. So the free gift is not like the offense. For if by the one man's, it's talking about Adam's offense, if by the one man's offense many died, and literally it's the many. For if by the one man's offense the many died, and it's kind of weird that Paul says many died instead of all, but that's what he says. He says, for if by the one man's offense the many died, and I understand that as they became mortals, talking about physical death, he says, much more the grace of God and the gift by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, abounded, or it's talking about a superabundance. It overflowed. It abounded to many, and again, it's the many, literally. And again, does he mean many or does he mean all? It's an issue we're going to talk about here. So first off, in this verse, we know that some versions use the word free when it's talking about the gift. They use that word free there in verse 15, and also in Romans 5 verse 16, and in Romans 5 verse 18. They're using the word free to describe the gift. But again, the word free, it's not in the Greek text, okay? It must be read into the text. And, technically speaking, every gift is free. But this doesn't mean that there's no conditions attached to our receiving the gift, to receiving that act of grace. So let's not be misled on this. Now back in Romans 5, in verses 12 through 14, Paul had begun to note the similarity between Adam and Jesus, in that they both, both men, Adam and Jesus, they both affect all of humanity. But here in verse 15, Paul mentions one of the many ways in which they are different. What Adam did versus what Jesus did are especially different when we consider the consequences that flow from them to the world. Also, about this verse, the word many, which occurs twice in verse 15, the word many, it may actually mean all. Gareth Reese comments on this. He says that many, the word many, it may be another of the Jewish expressions found in this context. In the light of Isaiah 53:12, that's the suffering servant passage, where Christ as the one is contrasted to mankind as the many. It says that basically Jesus bore the sins of many. Okay, and so many could mean all. Jesus bore the sins of many, but many actually means all. Bore the sins of all. That's what Gareth Reese is calling to our attention here. So he says that when this verse in Romans says the many died, Reese says a man familiar with the Old Testament would think of mankind, all mankind. When Paul says many, that many died, that a person familiar with the Old Testament would think, of mankind as the many who died. So that's what he says. C.K. Barrett, in his commentary on Romans, he says, it is true that Paul says the many died, but by many he can hardly mean anything different from the all men of verse 12. And he calls our attention also to 1 Corinthians 15:22. And Barrett says, this inclusive use of many is Hebraistic. It's a Hebrew expression, he's saying. In Old Testament usage, many often means not many contrasted with all, but many contrasted with one or some. So that's what these men say about this issue of Paul using the word many. That it could mean all actually. Now, back in Romans 5, verse 12, Paul said, death spread to all men. And then here in verse 15, he says, the many died. And then Paul says that the grace of God and the gift abounded, he's saying it super abundantly, overflowed to the many. Now, if in verse 15, if the second many, the use of the word many, if it really means all, then Paul could be understood or misunderstood to be teaching universal salvation. See the issue? However, when we consider the rest of the New Testament, surely neither this verse, Romans 5:15, nor any other verse, such as in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 21 and 22, surely neither one of these passages can be teaching universal salvation. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 21 and 22, Paul wrote this. He says, for since by man, he's talking about Adam, since by man came death, and again, I think he's talking about physical death. He says, by man, talking about Jesus this time, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. He's talking about the physical resurrection of the dead, that all are going to be raised physically. In verse 22, in 1 Corinthians 15:22, Paul says, for in Adam all die, talking about physically, they become mortal. As in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. Talking about physically, the physical resurrection. All shall be physically raised because of Christ's resurrection. Now, this passage from 1 Corinthians, it may only speak of all people being mortal and dying physically, and also being resurrected physically. And I know it's been interpreted in other ways, and maybe we'll talk more about those other interpretations later. But anyway, here in Romans 5, verse 15, Paul literally says that the many died because of Adam's sin. Paul did not say all, as he did in Romans 5, verse 12, and as he will say in Romans 5, verse 18. And ancient and modern commentators, they give various explanations for what Paul supposedly meant when he's shifting back and forth between speaking about all or many. And their explanations, they can be long and complicated. But many of them, they do believe that Paul is making a real distinction between all and many. Some of them believe that Paul speaks of physical death back in verse 12, while here in verse 15, he is saying that only many, not all, died spiritually as an indirect effect of Adam opening the door to sin, and that only many, not all, will experience the second death as a direct result of their own unrepentant sin, not Adam's. So various writers, they give different explanations of this all versus many issue. For example, I'll give you 3 examples of men commenting on verse 15, different ways in which they understand it. Origen, for example, he is writing. He flourished about from like 200 AD to 254 AD. Origen writes the following. He says it makes no difference that Paul said in verse 12 that sin spread to all, whereas here in verse 15 he says that the grace and gift of God have abounded for many. In Paul's usage, all and many are almost synonymous. Yet Paul refrains from saying that all will benefit from the grace of God, because if men had the assurance that they would be saved, they would not fear God and turn away from evil. Origen continues. Paul starts to explain how Adam may be regarded as a type of Christ. Any close similarity between them is obviously absurd, which is why he insists in verse 15 that the gift is not like the trespass. The judgment on Adam, Origen says, was that through his one sin, condemnation came to all men. But in sharp contrast to this, through Christ, justification is given to all for the many sins in which the entire human race is bound up. So, that's what Origen says. But he does say that he's understanding this to be seeing that justification, in a sense, is given to all. So, that's interesting that he says that. Significant, I think. Ambrosiaster. I'll give you a short quote from Ambrosiaster. He flourished, and it's an anonymous writer. We really don't know who Ambrosiaster actually is. He flourished from 366 to 384, approximately. Ambrosiaster says, "It is clear that Paul was not talking about ordinary death in verse 15, where he says, many. He says, which is common to us all, since everybody dies." So that's what Ambrosiaster thinks about, the death spoken of in verse 15. Another man, Diodore, if I'm saying that right, he died about 394 AD. He says, "At first sight, it may seem that this verse contradicts what Paul said." He's saying that verse 15. "At first sight, it may seem that this verse contradicts what Paul said in verse 12 above. For there he spoke of death having come to all humanity, whereas here he says only that many have died. In fact, there is no contradiction, because death, although it came upon all because we have all sinned," he's saying that death came only to test and to try everyone. Death does not destroy all sinners automatically, but only those who persist in their sins. By saying that many died, Paul shows merely that many turned out to be unrepentant in their sins." End quote. That just gives you an idea of, some variation of what these men thought about this passage. And, of course, if you want to speak, real strictly, not every human since Adam has died physically. Enoch and Elijah never did die. And not everyone will die before Jesus returns. Some will still be alive at his second coming. Now, all will be raised bodily, or at least transformed, as a result of Jesus' resurrection. But not all will be saved from their sins, although they can be, potentially. Those who receive justification in the sense of forgiveness, they receive it conditionally. But if the word justification can, in some sense, refer to the bodily resurrection, we're speaking of a physical justification, not a spiritual justification. If it can refer to the bodily resurrection, if the word justification can refer to that, and context determines the meaning of words. If this can be true, then all will be automatically justified in this special sense, physically justified. But not everyone will be saved. Not everyone will be spiritually justified. And, even though we know that concerning quantity, most people will end up in hell because of their sin, Paul seems to be saying here in verse 15 that the grace of God, channeled through Jesus, is much more powerful in quality than the indirect effects of Adam's sin. And this is because not only will all be raised, some of these will be raised in a forgiven and glorified state. Again, consider the different interpretations of these two writers I found. Chrysostom, he flourished from like 386 to 407 AD. Chrysostom says, Christ did not merely do the same amount of good to equal the harm of Adam. Rather, Christ did far more good and much greater good than Adam's harm. That is why Paul does not merely mention grace, but the superabundance of grace. He's referring to verse 15 about abounding. Chrysostom says, through this superabundance of grace, we, meaning Christians, receive far more than just the cancellation of the effects of Adam's sin. First, we are immediately freed from punishment. Second, we are empowered to put off all sin. Next, we are born again from above, and we rise anew with the old man having been buried. Then we are redeemed, justified, adopted, sanctified, and made brothers of the only begotten. Finally, we have become joint heirs with him and made one body with him. So that's Chrysostom. A man named Ecumenius, he's commenting somewhere in the 500s. He says this. He says, Christ's obedience was greater than Adam's disobedience in the following sense. Death, meaning death personified, death which originated with the sin of Adam, had our cooperation in the sins which we all committed. And so it was able to gain control over us. For if men had remained free from all wrongdoing, death would not have been in control. But the grace of Christ has come to us all. He's talking about the whole human race. The grace of Christ has come to us all without our cooperation. He's saying it came automatically. And shows that the grace of the resurrection is such that not only believers who glory in their faith will be resurrected, but also unbelievers, both Jews and Greeks. So he's talking about, the universal bodily resurrection that's coming. He says, something which works in us against our will, he's talking about something that works automatically, is therefore obviously greater than something which works in us with our cooperation. So he's saying that this greater grace, he's saying that it's talking about the physical resurrection, which again, this is interesting to me. So God's gift, it does bring a type of justification for all. But forgiveness, justification in the sense of forgiveness or acquittal, initial salvation, that's granted individually and on a conditional basis. But all will receive this physical justification, this physical rectification. Justification in that sense. That's coming to all. Romans 5 verse 16. Let's look at that. Romans 5 verse 16, where Paul says, and the gift is not like that which came through the one, he's talking about Adam, the gift of God, the gift of Jesus is not like the result which came through Adam, who sinned. Paul says, for the judgment, or the sentence, which came through the one offense, or transgression, resulted in condemnation. And I think he's talking about, the sentence of mortality, bodily mortality. And we have to ask, how many received that sentence? All, I think. And Paul continues. He says, but the free gift, again, the word free is not actually there, but the free gift, charisma is the Greek word Paul's using, but the free gift which came or arose from many offenses, using the word many, from many offenses, and this may be referring to all the personal sins of Adam's descendants. The free gift which came from many offenses resulted in justification. It resulted in justification. And the word being used there is dikaioma, if I'm saying that rightly, dikaioma. It resulted in justification, and this may be talking about bodily resurrection or physical resurrection, or you may think it's talking about, forgiveness, acquittal. But, and again, we ask the question, for how many? Was it for all, or how many was it for? Now, this word, dikaioma, the Greek word used here for justification, in verse 16, it seems to be a flexible word, is what I'm noticing. It seems to be a flexible word. It's translated differently in all the other places that it occurs in the New Testament. Here it's translated as justification. The ways that it's translated in other places include the following. It's translated, this word dikaioma, which translated as justification here, it's translated as the word judgment or judgments in Romans 1:32 and in Revelation 15:4. The same word is translated as righteousness in Romans 2:26 and Romans 8:4. It's translated as righteous act or righteous acts in Romans 5:18 and in Revelation 9:8. It's translated as ordinances in Luke 1:6, Hebrews chapter 9 verses 1 and 10. So what we have to remember is that the context, it's context that determines the meaning of words. So that's important to understand, because this seems to be a flexible word that means different things at different times. Paul speaks of death as being a physical death, and he means it in a spiritual sense too. A spiritual, so it's context. What's he talking about? Is he talking about a physical death or a spiritual death? Or is it a both and thing? Or one minute I'm referring to physical death, one minute I'm primarily speaking of spiritual death. Same thing would be with this word justification. It could refer to a spiritual justification at one time, forgiveness, acquittal, initial salvation, justification in that sense. In another sense, it may be talking about a physical justification, a physical rectification, the bodily resurrection, in other words. It's some thoughts, to take into consideration. So, in Romans 5:16, back to Romans 5:16, Paul is continuing to explain the contrast between Jesus and Adam. And as was the case in verse 15, again here the word free is nowhere present in the Greek text of verse 16. Yet it has been added to some English translations of this verse. In fact, this verse 16, it has quite a few words that has been supplied. A lot of translations make that plain by putting these added words in italics. They don't always do so consistently. But anyway, this verse has quite a few words that have been supplied, so it's a bit ambiguous. This verse, it could also be understood, like I said, depending on who's reading it and how you're understanding it, it could be understood to be teaching universal salvation, that everyone's going to heaven. Or like I said, maybe Paul's talking about the resurrection of all at the end of time. You know, the physical resurrection. Everyone's going to be raised and receive a resurrection body. Or maybe it's best to understand verse 16 to simply mean that that the two results of the two men's actions, Adam and Jesus, are unlike in that the judgment, the sentence of God that came from Adam's one sin brought the condemnation of physical death to all mankind. But the sacrifice of Jesus that was made due to many offenses brought the opportunity for all mankind to be justified in the sense of being forgiven, or initially saved or acquitted. He brought that opportunity for all mankind to be justified in that sense. In other words, Adam's sin brought mortality and physical death for all. Well, like I said earlier, there are exceptions, for that, like Enoch and Elijah. The Adam's sin brought mortality and death for all, while Christ's sacrifice brought salvation, justification in that sense. He brought salvation to all upon condition. There are conditions, like I said. And just to consider a couple of the translations of this verse in Romans 5:16. The Good News translation, for instance, in verse 16, it renders it this way. And there is a difference between God's gift and the sin of one man. After the one sin came the judgment of guilty. And I would think, that's the judgment of guilty for all, is what we're supposed to understand there. And this translation continues. It says, but after so many sins comes the undeserved gift of not guilty. And I would ask, is that also for all? This is the translation. Another translation to consider. The New American Standard in verse 16, it's rendered this way. The gift is not like that which came through the one, Adam, who sinned. For on the one hand, the judgment arose from one offense, resulting in condemnation. And I think that's talking about physical mortality. But, does that mean for all or for many is the issue? The translation continues. But on the other hand, the gracious gift arose from many offenses, resulting in justification. And I would ask, what kind of justification are we talking about? Are we talking about forgiveness, initial salvation, spiritual justification, like I said? It results in justification. Or are we talking about bodily resurrection? Are we talking about physical justification? And is it for all or for many? These are the issues. So, to continue in our progress here, let's go to verse 17 now, where Paul's talking about this abundant grace, which reigns. In verse 17, we read from the New King James Version. It says, "For if by the one man's offense," it's talking about Adam's offense, "for if by the one man's offense death," and I think it's talking about mortality, death reigned. He's saying that all humans died, they became subject to death, they became mortal. For if by the one man's offense death reigned, as if death was, it's being personified here. Death reigned through the one. He's talking about Adam. Death reigned through the one, through Adam. Much more, Paul says, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness. And there's righteousness there. The word is dikaiosune. Dikaiosune. And I think this is talking about this gift of righteousness. It's talking about justification in the sense of forgiveness, I think. Being right with God. Paul says that much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. Through the one man, the one mediator, Jesus Christ. In other words, Jesus' disciples will regain much more through Jesus than just endless life in the body. We have much more hope than that. It's the quality of the endless embodied life that we look forward to in His holy kingdom. Jesus' blood cleanses His followers from the guilt of our personal sin. It does not simply cancel the effects of Adam's sin, but we must receive the benefits of His blood by faith and by obeying the gospel. So there are conditions that are placed on this much more. Unlike the way everyone dies as a result of Adam's sin, not everyone is saved and then reigns in life as a result of Jesus' death. There are stipulations. If you want to reign in life instead of having death reign over you, then you must receive Jesus and submit to His good yoke and be transformed into a child of God. As the Apostle John wrote about this idea of receiving, in John chapter 1, verses 11 through 13, it's an interesting passage. John wrote, He, Jesus, came to His own, and His own did not receive Him. But as many as received Him, to them He gave the right. And I think a better translation, instead of he gave the right, or he gave the power, or possibly the privilege, to become children of God, to those who believe in His name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And that phrase where it says they were born, in verse 13, where they were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, that's referring to, the normal sexual procreative act is what that's referring to. Now, when it's talking about like I said, where it says He gave the right, as many as received Him, to them He gave the right, or the power, or the privilege to become children of God. Obedience to God's message gives us power. Okay? It gives us power. Disobedience takes it away. Erasmus, he said that this passage from John implies, we do not become sons of God suddenly, but first we are given the power which is offered us by the message of grace. Interesting. And if you look at various translations, you'll see that this word, He gave the right, exousia, is translated power in a number of different translations. And commenting on this passage from John, Chrysostom says this. He says, why then did he not say He made them sons of God instead of He gave them power to become sons of God? He did so to show how much zeal is needed to keep the image of sonship that was impressed on us at baptism, and to keep it all the way through without spot or soiling. At the same time, He also wanted to show that no one will be able to take this power from us unless we first deprive ourselves of it. For even in these mystical blessings, he's talking about the blessings of baptism. It is, on the one hand, God's part to give the grace, to give the power. On the other, a person's part to supply the faith. What follows needs much perseverance. In order to preserve our purity, it is not sufficient for us merely to have been baptized and to have believed. We must display a life worthy of it if we want to continually enjoy this brightness, this then is God's work in us. So it's a cooperation, is what he's saying. And, you know, one commentator commenting on this passage, John 1, verses 11 through 13, he says, this passage proves something must be done subsequent to faith to make us sons of God. Believing on his name did not make them sons of God, but placed this honor within reach, gave the privilege, or the power, gave the privilege and opportunity to become sons. And one translation I found that uses the word privilege there is the Weymouth New Testament. So, but even though we must do some things, is the point I'm making. We must do some things to receive Jesus and become a Christian. This does not mean that God owes sinners anything. It is God's gift of righteousness, as Paul puts it in verse 17. And this gift of righteousness, C.K. Barrett, he says it might mean, you know, this phrase, the gift of righteousness, it might mean the conferment of righteousness upon man, that is, you know, forgiveness, basically. It might mean that, or it might mean the gift which proceeds from God's righteousness. So that's interesting. But either way, God's way of saving humans, God's way of saving us, human beings, is a gift that is abundantly given. It is not a debt that he owes us. And whereas death reigned prior to Jesus, now that Jesus has come, we, you know, many of Jesus's followers can, or rather, as Paul puts it in verse 17, will reign in life through Jesus, both now and later. Now, here in Romans 5, verse 17, Paul is making a very confident statement about the future of those who begin to follow Jesus. He says that they will reign in life through Jesus. And logically, this statement is true as long as they remain in Christ and keep following Jesus. But Paul knows full well that things can happen that will derail the bright prospect or the bright future of someone who has once been genuinely justified in the sense of being forgiven or initially saved or acquitted. You know, we must receive this abundance of grace that is available through Jesus, and then we must cooperate with it, allowing ourselves to be changed by it, to reign in life, because we can resist it and we can fall from it. Paul knows that there is no once in grace, always in grace. There's no once justified, always justified. But he is confident of better things for these Roman Christians. And, you know, I am fairly confident that the gift of righteousness spoken of in verse 17 is initial justification. It's forgiveness or salvation or acquittal through faith in Jesus. As Pelagius comments, he says, righteousness is given through baptism and is not gained by merit. But this is just the beginning. And then we must live the life and persevere to the end. We must finish our race, ending it in a state of grace. It's important how we finish. And this is where we're going to stop here. We'll complete the rest of the chapter of Romans chapter 5 in the next lesson. But this passage, Romans 5 verses 15 through 17, in this passage the Apostle Paul has highlighted the contrast that exists between Adam's corrupting act of sin and Christ's redemptive act of grace, which results, as he says, in a gift for all mankind. Whereas Adam's sin brought death, Christ's life, death, and resurrection brings justification in the sense of forgiveness for some, you know, who receive it, and it brings brings justification in the sense of bodily resurrection for all. Christ's life, death, and resurrection brings abundant life to those who follow him. And it will also bring a physical resurrection of all humanity. In John 5:29, Jesus said that those who have done good will come forth to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil will come forth to the resurrection of condemnation. And Paul has told us that God's grace far surpasses Adam's transgression. For those who follow Jesus, God's grace will result in a gift that enables us, that empowers us, and that leads to righteousness and eternal life. And that's all I have. God bless.